You see the headlines everywhere flashing across your screen week after week. The Doomsday Glacier. The media throws the phrase around so much that you probably roll your eyes at this point. They use it as clickbait, a terrifying label attached to a problem that always seems conveniently far away. They tell you it is melting. They tell you it is a slow-motion disaster that might affect your great-grandchildren in 200 or 300 years. They show you computer-generated graphs with gentle sloping curves, projecting a gradual rise in sea levels that gives humanity plenty of time to adapt, build seawalls, and slowly migrate inland. But a discovery was just made that completely shatters that comfortable timeline. It proves that the old models were not just slightly off. They were fundamentally wrong about how the ice behaves. Because what they found under the surface proves that the event they keep warning you about in the distant future, it has begun. And it is happening right now, in real time, beneath the ice. And the most terrifying part is not the water rising on the coasts. The most terrifying part is what breaks next deep underground, long before the first city floods. The real threat is entirely invisible from the surface. To understand the sheer scale of what is happening right now, we have to look at the raw measurements. Recent satellite radar datasets have confirmed a 12-kilometer grounding line retreat along the eastern margin of the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica. 12 kilometers of foundational ice, completely unmoored from the bedrock. And according to a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2024, led by researcher Eric Rignot, this is not a slow thermal melt. Observational evidence from satellite radar interferometry proves that ocean tides are forcing warm, high-salinity seawater miles underneath the grounded ice sheet. This tidal subglacial melt is carving out massive cavities from the bottom up at a rate that is completely missing from traditional sea level rise projections. If you live anywhere near a coast, or if you rely on continental aquifers, the math just changed entirely. In today's video, I am going to show you exactly what is happening beneath the ice of West Antarctica, why the conventional models failed to predict it, and most importantly, what a specific documented vision from 1989 warned would be the real consequence of this collapse. Because before the end of this video, you will understand that the real danger of polar destabilization is not just a flood. It is a massive tectonic and subterranean pressure shift. The collapse of the polar ice does not end with the water rising. It begins with the ground fracturing beneath it. Every time you read about the Thwaites Glacier melting, you hear the same contradictory messaging. One article says it could happen over centuries. The next day, a new study comes out saying it is happening way faster than modeled. You are left confused, wondering which one is true. You get massive anxiety reading these reports, but when you talk about it, people call you crazy. They tell you that these warnings are all manufactured to control public behavior. But your frustration is completely valid, and it is documented. The reason you are confused is because the people projecting the 200-year timeline are using a mechanism that no longer applies to reality. They are calculating how long it takes for a block of ice to melt in a warm room. But that is not what is happening in Antarctica. To understand where this massive miscalculation comes from, we need to go back to the early days of satellite glaciology. For decades, the standard assumption was that glaciers melted at their edges, where the ice met the open ocean. The models assumed a linear progression, a slow, steady retreat, inch by inch, year by year. They looked at the surface temperature. They looked at the ambient water temperature. They did the math, and they told the world we had centuries to prepare. But there was a fundamental flaw in that math. They assumed the bedrock underneath the glacier was a flat, impermeable barrier. They assumed the grounding line, which is the exact point where the ice leaves the solid ground and begins to float on the ocean, was a solid stationary wall. But a recent field trial completely shattered that assumption. During recent oceanographic trials beneath the Thwaites ice shelf, scientists deployed an autonomous underwater robot. They drilled a borehole through the solid ice and sent this robot 600 meters down into the dark, freezing waters of the grounding zone. What it captured on video was unprecedented. It did not find a smooth, slowly melting wall of ice. It found warm ocean currents carving massive stair-step terraces and flat crevices directly into the base of the glacier. The water was not just touching the edge, it was cutting deep into the underbelly of the ice sheet. It was hollowing it out from the inside. This visual evidence was the first major crack in the conventional timeline. But the real revelation came from space. When Eric Rignot and his team analyzed the satellite radar interferometry data for their 2024 publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they saw something that the computer models had completely missed. They saw the tides. Every day the ocean rises and falls. We see it on the beaches. But in Antarctica, when the high tide comes in, it does not just splash against the front of the glacier. The immense pressure of the rising ocean forces warm, high-salinity seawater miles and miles underneath the grounded ice sheet. It pushes into the microscopic gaps between the ice and the bedrock. And because salt water has a lower freezing point than fresh water, and because this deep ocean current is relatively warm, it acts like a liquid blowtorch. It melts the foundation of the glacier from below. Then, when the tide goes out, it pulls the freshly melted fresh water back into the ocean, leaving a larger cavity behind. The next high tide pushes the warm water even further inland. This mechanism is called subglacial tidal pumping, and it changes everything. But let us pause for a moment and really visualize what this means on a planetary scale. We are not just talking about a trickle of water. We are talking about an ocean current driven by the gravitational pull of the moon, forcing millions of gallons of high salinity, relatively warm seawater into microscopic fissures under billions of tons of ice, twice a day, every single day. This is a rhythmic, relentless hydraulic pounding. The traditional models assumed that because the water at the bottom of the ocean is cold, it would not have the thermal capacity to melt the ice quickly. But they did not account for the sheer physical friction and the constant renewal of the saltwater supply. When the tide goes out, it acts as a vacuum, pulling the glacial meltwater out into the Southern Ocean. This creates a pressure differential that actively sucks the next high tide even deeper into the grounding zone. It is a self-amplifying feedback loop. The deeper the ocean cuts into the underbelly of the glacier, the less friction there is holding the ice back. The less friction there is, the faster the massive ice sheet above begins to flow toward the ocean. This is exactly what the satellite radar datasets from the National Snow and Ice Data Center captured in 2026. A 12-kilometer retreat is not a slow melt. It is the beginning of an unmooring. It is the glacier physically detaching from the continent. To make this perfectly clear, think about a heavy wooden door that is stuck in its frame. If you want to take the door off its hinges, you do not stand in front of it and blow hot air on it, hoping it will shrink. That would take forever. Instead, you take a crowbar, you wedge it under the bottom edge of the door, and you apply pressure. The leverage lifts the entire massive structure with relatively little effort. The warm ocean tides are the crowbar. The Thwaites Glacier is the door. The ocean is not melting the glacier from the top down. It is using hydrostatic pressure to unmoor the glacier from the bottom up. And the problem does not stop here. There is a part of this mechanism that the majority of people do not know. When you introduce warm seawater miles beneath a grounded ice sheet, you do not just melt the ice. You change the structural integrity of the entire mass. According to recent research by Antarctic glaciology groups, this subglacial intrusion causes microfracture propagation. The water acts as a lubricant, and the tidal pressure creates immense stress on the solid ice above. These microfractures connect, grow, and accelerate into structural rift cascades across the grounding zone. This means the ice is not just slowly dissolving, it is cracking and shattering from within. The structural failure happens significantly faster than thermal melting alone. And if you think this is just an abstract problem for glaciologists to worry about, you need to understand the sheer physical scale of the Thwaites Glacier. This is not just a large block of ice. It is roughly the size of the entire state of Florida, or the entire country of Great Britain. It is a frozen landmass in its own right, towering hundreds of meters above the bedrock and plunging deep into the ocean. The structural integrity of this mass is what dictates the behavior of the entire West Antarctic ice sheet behind it. Think of it like a massive architectural retaining wall holding back a mountain of loose gravel. If that retaining wall is slowly eroding from the top, you can calculate exactly when the gravel will spill over. You can plan for it. You can build secondary walls. But if someone is using a hydraulic jack to shatter the foundation of that retaining wall from underneath, the math of erosion becomes completely irrelevant. The wall is not going to slowly crumble. It is going to suddenly detach and fall forward, and the entire mountain of gravel behind it is going to come crashing down all at once. This is the difference between the linear thermal melting models we were sold for decades and the rapid structural rift cascades we are witnessing right now through satellite radar interferometry. The problem is not just that the models were wrong. The problem is that they bred a false sense of security that has left every coastal city and every inland aquifer management system completely unprepared for what happens when the retaining wall gives way. This is the math that simply does not add up. Look at the conventional models. They assume thermal melting. They tell governments to plan for a gradual sea level rise over 2 centuries. Now, look at the observational evidence. 12 kilometers of grounding line retreat, tidal pumping forcing warm water miles inland, subglacial rift cascades shattering the foundation. The arithmetic of a slow transition is entirely broken. The reality points to a sudden catastrophic detachment, and this is where the story shifts. Because you might be thinking, if the glacier collapses, the sea level rises and coastal cities flood. That is the obvious conclusion. But here is something that seems to make no sense. The flooding is actually the secondary problem. The primary problem, the one that happens first, has nothing to do with the coasts. It has to do with the ground directly beneath your feet, thousands of miles away from the ocean. To understand this, we need to look at a completely different set of records. We need to step away from the satellite data and look at the archival documentation from 1989. We need to look at the primary biographical dictations of the Bulgarian mystic Baba Vanga, recorded by Krasimira Stoyanova. When people talk about prophecies and visions, they usually expect mystical, metaphorical language about giant waves and sinking continents. They expect a Hollywood disaster movie script. But when you read the actual primary transcripts from the Eastern European scientific archives from the 1970s and 1980s, the descriptions are surprisingly physical and sequential. Baba Vanga did not claim an immediate mythical submergence of the continents. She described a very specific physical chain reaction. In her dictations, she referred to a time when the polar ice would destabilize. Her exact phrasing translated to the White Mountains bleeding. For decades, people interpreted this simply as the ice melting into the ocean. But the sequence she described next is what completely changes the paradigm. She stated that this polar degradation would trigger a failure, beginning with subterranean water table inversions and internal pressure rebalancing rather than immediate surface inundation. She warned that the melting ice would initiate deep subterranean tectonic stress shifts across continental landmasses. For years, skeptics argued that connecting these dictations to glaciology was unfalsifiable speculation. They said it was just a lucky guess, a vague warning about water. But look at the mechanism she described: subterranean water table inversion, tectonic stress shifts, internal pressure rebalancing. This is not the language of a mythical flood. This is the exact language of geophysics. And it is exactly here that your own life and the ground you walk on enters the story. You see, the Thwaites Glacier is not just a big piece of ice. It acts as the primary structural pin holding back the entire West Antarctic ice sheet. It is the keystone in an arch. If you remove the keystone, the entire arch collapses. The Thwaites Glacier contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by over 65 centimeters on its own. But if it unmoors, it destabilizes the neighboring ice basins. We are talking about millions of cubic kilometers of ice, holding billions of tons of frozen water. Now, imagine holding a heavy weight on your chest while lying on a mattress. The mattress compresses under the pressure. If you suddenly lift that weight, what happens to the mattress? It rebounds. It pushes back up. This is exactly how the Earth's crust works. It is a process called isostatic rebound. For millions of years, the immense weight of the Antarctic ice sheet has been pressing down on the continental bedrock, pushing it deep into the Earth's mantle. This massive localized pressure creates a delicate hydrostatic and tectonic equilibrium across the entire planet. The pressure in Antarctica counterbalances the pressure in other tectonic plates. It affects the deep subterranean aquifers that span across continents. When you suddenly unmoor that ice, when the tidal subglacial melting causes the structural rift cascades to shatter the Thwaites Glacier, you are not just adding water to the ocean. You are removing billions of tons of localized pressure from the Earth's crust in a very short amount of time. And when that pressure is released, the crust rebounds. The tectonic plates shift to accommodate the new weight distribution. The deep underground water tables, the massive continental aquifers that provide fresh water to millions of people, suddenly face a massive internal pressure rebalancing. The salt water from the rising oceans pushes into the coastal aquifers, while the tectonic shifts disrupt the deep inland freshwater reserves. This is the subterranean water table inversion that was documented in the 1989 transcripts. To really grasp the magnitude of this subterranean shift, we have to look at how continental groundwater systems actually function. Most people imagine aquifers as large, static underground lakes, but they are not. They are incredibly complex, highly pressurized networks of porous rock and sediment that stretch for thousands of miles across tectonic plates. The water in these aquifers is held in a delicate balance by the immense hydrostatic pressure of the ocean on one side and the tectonic weight of the continental crust on the other. When you remove the localized pressure of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Earth's crust begins to undergo isostatic rebound. The tectonic plates flex and shift, and when the plates flex, the massive underground aquifers flex with them. The internal pressure rebalancing forces the ancient, deep freshwater reserves upward, while simultaneously drawing the rising high-salinity seawater inward from the coasts. This is the water table inversion. It means that long before the ocean physically overtops the coastal sea walls and floods the streets of Miami or New York, the salt water will have already intruded miles inland, contaminating the freshwater wells, destroying agricultural soil from below, and rendering entire regions uninhabitable. The physical flooding of the surface is just the final visible symptom of a terminal disease that has already ravaged the subterranean systems. And the most chilling part of this entire mechanism is that it was not discovered by the modern climate models. The models completely missed it. This exact sequence, the polar ice degradation triggering the deep subterranean tectonic stress shifts and the water table inversion, was explicitly detailed in the 1989 biographical recordings of a blind Bulgarian mystic. The science took decades and billions of dollars in satellite technology to catch up to a vision documented before most of these researchers had even started their careers. You think this is just a local problem for Antarctica? Look at the subterranean hydrodynamics. When the pressure shifts at the pole, the stress transfers through the continental plates. The White Mountains bleeding does not just mean the ice is melting, it means the structural integrity of the Earth's crust is bleeding its internal pressure. This is the revelation that the conventional models missed, and that the 1989 dictations captured perfectly. The danger is not just the slow creep of water onto the beaches. The danger is the rapid, violent rebalancing of the Earth's internal systems. The danger is the tectonic stress shifts that alter the geological stability of the land masses we live on. And if you think this is only a theoretical problem, consider what is happening right now in coastal aquifers around the world. We are already seeing saltwater intrusion contaminating freshwater supplies miles inland. We are already seeing unexplained microseismic activity in regions far from traditional fault lines. The pressure is already shifting. The sequence has already begun. If you have been feeling a strange sense of anxiety when you read the news about the climate, if you have been feeling like the official explanations just do not cover the whole truth, you are not crazy. You are sensing the massive gap between what the surface models predicted and what the deep physics actually dictate. You recognize that the arithmetic of a slow, gradual melt did not match the chaotic, accelerating reality you were witnessing. Remember the subglacial tidal pumping I mentioned earlier? The ocean acting like a crowbar under a door? That mechanism is entirely hidden from the surface. You cannot see it by looking at satellite photos of the top of the ice. You only see it when you drill 600 meters down, or when you use advanced radar interferometry to measure the microscopic uplift of the ice sheet during high tide. The most destructive forces in this equation are completely invisible to the naked eye. And this is the paradox of our modern understanding. The more we focus on the visible surface, the more we miss the invisible foundation. We stare at the top of the glacier, watching for cracks, while the ocean quietly hollows out the base. We worry about the water lapping at our shoes while the ground beneath our feet prepares to shift. The solution to understanding this threat is the exact opposite of what conventional wisdom suggests. You do not look up at the melting ice. You look down at the shifting pressure. This is why it is so crucial to bridge the gap between empirical science and archival warnings. The science provides the mechanism. The satellite datasets from 2026 confirm the 12-kilometer retreat. The 2024 publication confirms the tidal pumping. The 2025 research confirms the fracture cascades, but the 1989 transcripts provide the sequence of consequences. They tell us what breaks next. They warn us that when the ice goes, the water table flips. The subterranean pressure rebalances. The tectonic stress shifts. This is a chain reaction that does not care about our 200-year projections. It only cares about physics. And this brings us to a fascinating historical paradox. For over a century, the rigid institutions of modern science have systematically dismissed the oral traditions, the mystical dictations, and the historical warnings of people like Baba Vanga. They categorized these records as folklore, as mythological metaphors that had no place in the serious empirical study of our planet's future. They demanded peer-reviewed papers, satellite imagery, and complex algorithmic models. They built massive supercomputers to predict the behavior of the ice sheets, completely confident that their thermal equations contain the absolute truth of our environmental destiny. But when those supercomputers finally processed the advanced radar interferometry from 2024, when the autonomous underwater vehicles finally descended into the freezing abyss of the grounding zone, what did they find? They found the exact physical sequence that the dismissed oral traditions had warned about decades earlier. The science did not disprove the dictation. The science spent billions of dollars and decades of research only to arrive at the exact same terrifying conclusion. The White Mountains are bleeding from underneath. The structural integrity of the crust is failing, and the deep subterranean aquifers are preparing to invert. The ultimate irony is that the people who were ridiculed for paying attention to the 1989 transcripts were actually decades ahead of the glaciologists who were stubbornly staring at the surface of the ice, completely blind to the tidal forces ripping the foundation apart from below. Think about the profound implications of that reality. It means that the timeline we have been fed is not just a scientific error. It is the result of a systemic refusal to look at the Earth as a deeply interconnected pressurized system. We were taught to view the planet as a series of isolated compartments. The ice is in one compartment, the oceans are in another, and the solid ground we walk on is in a third. If the ice melts, the ocean compartment fills up. That is the simplistic arithmetic we were given. But the Earth does not operate in isolated compartments. It operates as a singular, highly reactive organism. The pressure exerted by the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica directly counterbalances the tectonic stress under the North American continent. The glacial meltwater does not just dilute the ocean, it alters the massive thermohaline circulation currents that regulate the global climate. The isostatic rebound of the bedrock does not just lift the Antarctic continent, it shifts the hydrostatic equilibrium of every major coastal aquifer on the planet. When you begin to understand this level of connectivity, you realize that the phrase Doomsday Glacier is actually completely inadequate. It implies that the glacier itself is the doomsday. But the glacier is just the first domino in a subterranean chain reaction that alters the very architecture of the continents. The true danger is not the ice disappearing. The true danger is the violently rapid release of the immense pressure that the ice was holding in place for millions of years. If you made it this far into the video, you are already standing in a very small, very distinct group of people. The vast majority of the public has completely tuned out the warnings about the Doomsday Glacier. They have heard the term so many times attached to so many distant abstract timelines that they have become entirely numb to it. They think it is just another exaggerated headline designed to generate clicks. They simply live with the background noise of the warnings without ever understanding the actual mechanics of the threat. But you have moved past that noise. You now understand the fundamental difference between thermal melting and subglacial tidal pumping. You know exactly what the satellite radar interferometry revealed beneath the ice. You know about the 12-kilometer retreat and the massive cavities carved by warm, high-salinity seawater. You understand that the primary danger is not just the immediate flooding of the coasts, but the rapid, catastrophic isostatic rebound of the Earth's crust. You understand the tectonic stress shifts and the subterranean water table inversions documented decades ago. You possess the complete picture, connecting the cutting-edge empirical data with the precise historical sequences. You are no longer reliant on the sanitized, delayed projections that keep the general public pacified. The only thing that separates having this knowledge from being prepared for what is coming is the willingness to accept that the timeline has already shifted and the willingness to act on the information that the majority still dismisses as a distant myth. If you made it this far and this content makes sense to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This is very important for the algorithm to understand that this content has value for you and tells the platform that you want to see more videos like this. The only question that remains after all this is, are you going to keep pretending you do not know what is shifting beneath the surface? I am going to stop right here. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe we are witnessing a predictable natural cycle or the beginning of a cascading global shift? I want to hear your perspective.